This is a shipping container, 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, the standard unit that moves 90% of global trade. Right now, there are roughly 25 million of these containers circulating through the world's ports, carrying everything from electronics to furniture to auto parts. For 30 years, the contents of these containers have followed a predictable path. Raw materials flow into China. Finished goods flow out of China. The world buys. China manufactures. The container ships run the same routes, month after month, decade after decade, with mechanical reliability. That system broke on January 13, 2026. At 9 a.m. Indian Standard Time, the Reserve Bank of India announced a policy change that trade economists are still struggling to comprehend. Effective immediately, all imports from China must be settled in Indian rupees. Not dollars, not yuan, rupees. Any Indian company paying for Chinese goods in any currency other than rupees faces a 47% emergency tariff on top of existing duties. 47%. Overnight. With no negotiation, no phase-in period, no warning to trading partners. Within 72 hours, $340 billion in annual bilateral trade, the largest trading relationship in the developing world, ground to a halt. Container ships en route to Indian ports began diverting to Singapore and Dubai. Letters of credit denominated in dollars were rejected by Indian banks. Purchase orders placed in December were canceled by the thousands. This is not a trade dispute. This is not tariff retaliation. This is India weaponizing its currency to break its economic dependence on China, and in the process, fracturing the payment infrastructure that global trade depends on. Here's what they're not telling you. India's rupee mandate didn't come from nowhere. It came from 3 years of strategic suffocation that pushed New Delhi to a breaking point. Since 2022, India's trade deficit with China has exploded. In 2021, India imported $65 billion more from China than it exported. By 2025, that deficit reached $118 billion, the largest bilateral trade imbalance in Indian history. Every year, $118 billion in Indian demand flows into Chinese factories, funding Chinese jobs, building Chinese infrastructure, strengthening a strategic rival that India increasingly views as an existential threat. The imports aren't optional. India doesn't make its own semiconductors. It doesn't produce active pharmaceutical ingredients at scale. It doesn't manufacture the solar panels its renewable targets require, or the telecom equipment its 5G rollout demands. For critical industrial inputs, India depends on China the way an addict depends on a dealer, aware of the dependence, unable to break it, watching the cost compound year after year. The rupee mandate is cold turkey. India is attempting to break the addiction, not by reducing imports, they can't, not quickly, but by changing how those imports are paid for. The logic is elegant in theory. Force Chinese exporters to accept rupees, and suddenly India isn't draining dollar reserves to fund its trade deficit. The dollars stay in India. The rupees pile up in Chinese accounts where they can only be spent on Indian exports that don't exist at scale. In theory, this reverses the dependency. China accumulates rupees it cannot easily use. India conserves dollars it desperately needs. The trade imbalance continues, but its strategic consequences diminish. In practice, China said no. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. To understand why India's gambit broke global trade, you need to understand why China rejected payment in rupees, and what that rejection set in motion. The rupee is not a freely convertible currency. It's managed by the Reserve Bank of India, which restricts how rupees can be moved across borders, converted to other currencies, or used in international transactions. A Chinese exporter receiving rupees faces a problem. Those rupees are trapped. They can't be easily converted to yuan. They can't be deposited in Chinese banks that don't have rupee facilities. They can't be used to pay Chinese workers or suppliers or taxes. Rupee payment, from a Chinese exporter's perspective, is not payment at all. It's an IOU, denominated in a currency they cannot use, from a country whose banking system they cannot access, subject to controls they cannot predict. On January 14th at 6:30 a.m. Beijing time, the Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China issued a directive to all registered exporters. Transactions with Indian counterparties must be settled in yuan, US dollars, or euros. Rupee settlement is prohibited pending resolution of currency compatibility concerns. China didn't retaliate with tariffs. They didn't sanction Indian companies. They simply refused to accept the currency India demanded they take. And in refusing, they revealed the fundamental asymmetry that India's gambit ignored. China doesn't need India. India needs China. The trade data proves it. China exports $118 billion more to India than it imports, but India represents only 3.2% of Chinese exports. For China, losing Indian trade entirely would be a nuisance. For India, losing Chinese imports would be a catastrophe. The solar panels stop arriving. The smartphones stop arriving. The antibiotics stop arriving. The telecommunications equipment that India's 1.4 billion people depend on stops arriving. India fired an economic weapon at a rival that can survive the blast. The ricochet is hitting everyone else. When two nuclear economies break payment infrastructure, everyone in the blast radius suffers. The container ships diverted from Indian ports didn't disappear. They rerouted to Singapore, to Dubai, to Colombo, creating instant congestion at ports not designed to handle the overflow. Within 96 hours of the rupee mandate, container dwell times at Singapore's PSA terminals increased from 2.3 days to 7.8 days. Vessels scheduled to load goods for Europe and America were stuck behind ships loaded with Chinese goods that no longer had an Indian destination. Freight rates responded immediately. The Shanghai to Rotterdam container rate, which had stabilized at $1,400 per 40-foot equivalent unit, jumped to $2,900 by Friday. Not because demand increased, because capacity got stuck in the wrong places, rerouting around a payment dispute that has nothing to do with European or American importers, but everything to do with the shipping networks they depend on. The banking system froze even faster. Correspondent banking relationships between Indian and Chinese institutions, the plumbing that allows payments to flow across borders, began closing within 48 hours. Standard Chartered, which processes 40% of India-China trade finance, suspended new letter of credit issuance, pending regulatory clarity. HSBC followed. DBS followed. The pipes through which $340 billion per year flowed are now clogged with transactions that neither side will complete. At 2:15 a.m. Eastern on Thursday, the Bank for International Settlements convened an emergency call with central bank governors from the G20. The subject: systemic implications of bilateral payment disruptions. The call lasted 4 hours. No statement was issued. The silence tells you that no solution was found. Less than 21 days remain before the first wave of payment obligations comes due on February 3rd. Indian importers who ordered Chinese goods in December must pay by that date or face default. Those payments are denominated in dollars, the currency India's mandate prohibits. The importers cannot legally pay. The Chinese exporters cannot ship without payment. The goods sit in warehouses on both sides of the border, representing billions in stranded inventory. The defaults, when they begin, will cascade. Indian importers default to Chinese exporters. Chinese exporters default to their banks on working capital loans. Banks tighten credit for all China trade. The tightening spreads beyond India to any transaction touching Chinese manufacturing, which is to say, virtually all global trade. While one side postures, the other side adapts. India's rupee mandate was supposed to demonstrate strength. Instead, it demonstrated dependency. And China's response is designed to make that dependency permanent. On January 16th, Beijing announced an expansion of yuan credit facilities to Indian importers willing to bypass the rupee mandate. Chinese state banks will lend yuan directly to Indian companies, allowing them to pay Chinese exporters in the currency China demands. The loans are offered at 3.2% interest, below market rates, below what Indian banks charge for trade finance, below any commercial logic except strategic logic. The message is unmistakable. India can mandate rupee settlement. China can make yuan settlement more attractive. Indian companies facing the choice between complying with their own government's policy and keeping their supply chains alive will choose survival. They'll take the yuan loans. They'll pay in yuan. They'll become more dependent on Chinese currency, not less. This is currency warfare at its most sophisticated. India swung first. China counterpunched with financing that makes defection from Indian policy the rational choice for every Indian business with Chinese exposure. The United States is notably absent from this conflict. Washington has spent 3 years trying to build supply chain alternatives to China through India. The China Plus One strategy, diversifying manufacturing to India as a hedge against Chinese concentration, depends on India being a stable alternative. A country engaged in currency warfare with its largest supplier is not stable. It's a risk multiplier. American companies with Indian manufacturing operations are now caught between an Indian government demanding rupee settlement and Chinese suppliers refusing to accept it. Apple's iPhone assembly in Chennai depends on Chinese components. Samsung's appliance plants in Noida depend on Chinese parts. Every made-in-India product with Chinese content is now hostage to a payment dispute neither American boardrooms nor Washington policymakers can resolve. The irony is architectural. America pushed India to reduce Chinese dependency. India's method for reducing dependency is breaking the trade infrastructure that American supply chain diversification requires. The cure is killing the patient. This is what a fracturing trade system looks like. The container ships will eventually move. The payment systems will eventually clear. The defaults will be worked out through negotiation or bankruptcy or government intervention. This specific crisis will pass. What won't pass is the precedent. India demonstrated that a major economy will weaponize currency policy to wage economic war on a trading partner. China demonstrated that it will respond by offering financial incentives that undermine the weaponizing country's sovereignty. Both demonstrated that the dollar-based multilateral trading system, the infrastructure that has governed global commerce since 1944, can be bypassed, challenged, and broken when nations decide their interests require it. The next currency mandate might come from Brazil against Argentina, or Turkey against Europe, or any nation that decides that trade dependency has become strategic vulnerability. January 13th proved it's possible. Possible becomes probable once the template exists. Some will see this as a regional dispute, an India-China problem that affects shipping routes and commodity prices, but doesn't fundamentally alter how the world works. These are the same voices that said Brexit was a local issue, that said the US-China trade war was containable, that said supply chain disruptions were temporary adjustments. The voices always minimize until the minimizing becomes impossible. Others will recognize what the rupee mandate reveals, that the assumptions underlying global trade, convertible currencies, neutral payment systems, predictable settlement, are not laws of physics. They're political arrangements that nations can abandon when the politics change, that the system works because participants choose to make it work, and that choices can change overnight, at 9 a.m. on a Monday, with a press release and a 47% tariff. The informed are not predicting the end of global trade. Trade will continue. It always does. What the informed recognize is that the trade that continues will be more fragmented, more expensive, more political than the trade that came before. That the era of frictionless globalization is ending not with a single collapse, but with 1,000 cuts. Each one a policy decision, a retaliatory measure, a currency mandate that makes the next one more likely. This is not financial advice. This is not a recommendation to short shipping companies or avoid emerging markets or take any position based on India-China tensions. This is simply an observation about what happens when the second and third largest economies by purchasing power decide to fight, and why the shrapnel hits everyone. The container ships are rerouting, the payment systems are freezing, the defaults are coming. 21 days until February 3rd. 21 days until the first wave of stranded transactions must settle or fail. 21 days until the world discovers whether this was a negotiating tactic or the opening salvo of a trade war with no rules and no referees. India fired the shot. China absorbed it. Global trade is caught in the crossfire. And the shipping container, that 40-foot box that moves 90% of world commerce, is learning that it cannot move when the payment for its contents is denominated in a currency neither side will accept. That's not a trade dispute. That's a system breaking.